Okay, so let's jump in. We're doing a deep dive today into a figure who really feels like he's at the absolute center of 20th century America, Arthur Miller.
He really is. It's hard to think of someone else who embodied so many contradictions.
Right. I mean, here's a guy who was a Pulitzer Prize-winning literary legend, but also, at the same time, a global tabloid spectacle. And on top of all that, he became, one of the most important voices of American conscience during decades of turmoil.
And that synthesis, that mix of high art and this intensely public scrutinized life and this fierce political spine, that's really our mission today.
Yeah, exactly.
We're not just here to, skim the plots of death of a salesman or the Crucible. We really need to go deeper and synthesize these huge, turbulent parts of his life.
Like his early financial trauma, which is so key.
So key. And then the political battles with HUAC and, of course, the incredibly complicated, very, very public marriages.
Absolutely. We're sort of on a shortcut here to understanding how he took all of these massive anxieties of modern American life, things like the failure of capitalism, this deep political paranoia, personal betrayal, and somehow distilled all of it into these universal, timeless tragedies.
And to do that, our sources really point to three essential spheres of his life. We have to unpack all three.
Okay, so what's the first one?
First, obviously, are the works. The foundational plays that didn't just entertain people, they fundamentally reshaped what American tragedy could even look like on a stage.
And second has to be the politics.
Yes, those critical years where his personal refusal, his refusal to betray other people, put him head-to-head with the full power of the United States Congress.
And finally, you can't talk about Miller without talking about the personal.
Not at all. A life just defined by this high-stakes drama of his celebrity, especially his marriage to Marilyn Monroe, but also, and this is crucial, the deeply guarded, very painful secrets of his own family life.
And this is where I think the core insight of our whole deep dive is we have to keep this in mind the whole time we're talking. It's this profound contradiction.
The public versus the private.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Arthur Miller had this immense public moral courage. I mean, he stood up to the state, he defended the oppressed, he wrote these fiery critiques of social injustice.
No question.
But, and it's a huge but, he also demonstrated this profound personal failure, even abandonment, in his private life, especially with his son Daniel.
And that's the question, isn't it? That's the thing to chew on.
Yeah.
Did his ability to write such compelling moral dramas, these stories about impossible choices, did that come from his own internal struggle? His own attempt to reconcile his incredible public bravery with these intensely guarded, maybe even shameful, private failings?
It's fascinating because that conflict seems to run through everything he ever wrote. He turned America's internal anxieties into these universal tragedies.
He was holding America accountable, absolutely. Yeah. But at the same time, you get the sense he was struggling with his own personal accountability. And it's that tension, I think. That's what made his work so vital and, so enduring.
So let's start at the very beginning, because you really can't understand Arthur Miller's skepticism about the American dream without understanding the financial trauma that forged him.
It's the origin story.
It really is. He was born in 1915 in Harlem, and he grew up in, remarkable comfort. His father, Isidore, was a prosperous Polish-Jewish businessman. He owned a major women's clothing manufacturing business.
Not just major. It employed over 400 people. I mean, this was a significant enterprise.
A huge deal. And they had all the trappings of real 1920s affluence. A chauffeur, a big apartment on West 110th Street, a summer house out in Far Rockaway, Queens.
It's almost a Gilded Age picture of luxury. And that comfortable existence is what makes the fall so much more dramatic. It's this textbook example of, sudden wealth meeting the complete and utter failure of the economic system.
Right, because then the 1929 Wall Street crash happens, and it didn't just hit the family hard. They didn't just suffer losses.
No, they lost almost everything.
And the toll of that, the physical and the psychological toll must have been immense. They were forced to move out of Manhattan entirely. They had to relocate to a much smaller, much less glamorous life in Gravesend, Brooklyn.
Miller wrote about this later. He talked about that rapid descent from privilege right down into poverty. It was a trauma that just fundamentally colored his entire perspective on what prosperity even meant.
And you can draw a straight line from that experience to his greatest place?
Absolutely. That dramatic, sudden material loss is the engine for his best work, especially Death of a Salesman. It taught him, I think, that the promise of upward mobility, this whole idea of the American dream as some kind of guaranteed security, was just a brittle illusion. It was built on shifting sand.
Because if his own successful father could lose everything overnight?
then the whole structure of American capitalism was fundamentally flawed. The failure of the provider, the father, and the collapse of that material promise, that became his central theme for the rest of his life.
And that early experience of just working to survive, that also defined his path to getting an education.
Yeah, it wasn't a given for him.
Not at all. After he graduated from Abraham Lincoln High School in 1932, he spent 2 years working these menial jobs. The sources say he was delivering bread every morning before school.
Just to save enough money for tuition at the University of Michigan. It was a struggle.
And his time at Michigan is so critical for understanding his craft, right?
Oh, absolutely. He started out in journalism. He was writing for the Michigan Daily. But then he switched to English and playwriting.
Yeah.
And that move was pivotal because it put him in contact with a crucial mentor.
Professor Kenneth Rowe.
Professor Kenneth Rowe, who taught him what he called the dynamics of play construction. So Miller didn't just learn how to tell a story. He learned how a play was almost engineered, meticulously built to achieve a specific emotional and critical effect on the audience.
And he got immediate proof that he was on the right path.
Right away. He won the Avery Hopwood Award for his very first play, No Villain, in 1936. So by the time he graduates, he isn't just an aspiring writer, he's an award-winning one. And that gave him the confidence, the momentum to pursue this career seriously, even if it meant making some risky choices.
And those choices were political from the jump.
Immediately political. It's clear his leanings started very early, long before the McCarthy era made it so dangerous. In 1935, while he's still a student, he joins the League of American Writers.
And that group was largely made up of, well, Communist Party members or what they called fellow travelers.
Yeah, and we should probably clarify what fellow traveler meant back then. It's a term you hear a lot.
Good idea. Was it the same as being a card-carrying communist?
Not legally, no, but socially and professionally, especially in the eyes of the government, that distinction got really blurry. A fellow traveler was basically a non-member who was highly sympathetic to the Communist Party's goals and policies.
Especially on things like anti-fascism and labor rights during the Depression.
Exactly. For Miller, it was about social commitment. It was about aligning himself with labor and political critique, not necessarily embracing, the entire Stalinist ideology. But that affiliation was already marking him. It was putting a file on him somewhere.
And that choice put him on a collision course with what was coming down the line politically. After he graduates in 1938, he makes this huge professional decision.
The major fork in the road.
He chooses to join the Federal Theater Project, which was a New Deal agency, over a much, much more lucrative offer to be a scriptwriter for 20th Century Fox.
And that single choice, it just speaks volumes about his priorities, doesn't it? He chose public service and socially committed art over Hollywood money.
But that professional commitment turned out to be dangerous right away.
Almost immediately. The Federal Theater Project was shut down in 1939 by Congress itself because of these rising conservative fears about communist infiltration.
That closure is just chillingly prophetic, isn't it?
It really is. It shows that the surveillance and the concern over left-leaning artists was already happening a full decade before HUAC would come for him directly.
So after that, he had to work at the Brooklyn Navy Yard, which was a practical move, and he kept writing radio plays for CBS to keep his creative muscles sharp. But those early choices, they really highlight the moral calculus that would define his entire public life.
Conscience over career safety. Every time.
So the 1940s are really the story of Miller's persistence, right? He has to push through this early failure, which then leads to this sudden explosive arrival on the American stage.
Yeah, we should remember the context here. Miller was exempt from military service in World War II. He had a high school football injury to his left kneecap. So while a lot of his peers were overseas, he was at home, focused entirely on his craft in a country that was changing really, really fast.
And his first shot at Broadway was not exactly a success.
That's putting it mildly.
His first produced play, The Man Who Had All the Luck, in 1944. I mean, it managed to win the Theater Guild's National Award, which is great, but on Broadway it was a complete disaster.
A flop. It closed after just 4 performances. The reviews were overwhelmingly negative.
You have to imagine what that does to a young writer. You're award-winning, you get to Broadway, and then it just completely fails. That kind of setback can just stop a career cold.
But he rebounded so quickly, and he did it by focusing his attention on these social issues that really resonated with the post-war audience. In 1947, he comes back with All My Sons.
And that play had been taking shape for a while, since around 1941.
Right, and its success finally established his reputation. It won him his first Tony Award for Best Author.
And the play itself, it tackles this profound post-war moral problem. A factory owner who knowingly ships defective airplane parts during the war. And this leads to the deaths of pilots, including, tragically, his own son. It's just a crushing commentary on the cost of American capitalism when ambition trumps ethics.
And what's so fascinating about All My Sons is that it almost suffered the same fate as his first play.
It almost failed, too.
Yeah. Miller himself noted that critics at the time found it a very depressing play in a time of great optimism. America was, soaring after the victory, the economy was booming, and here comes Miller focusing on moral compromise and failure.
It was saved, really, by one person.
Brooks Atkinson of the New York Times.
Right. Atkinson had the power to make or break a show, and his positive review was basically the critical lifeline that kept the production running. It ensured Miller survived his second try at Broadway.
And that narrow escape seems to have prepared him for what came next, the play that would permanently define him. Just 2 years later, in 1949, we get Death of a Salesman.
It's just remarkable how quickly the highest point of his professional life happened right as his political persecution was beginning.
They converged completely.
The sheer speed and the cultural impact of Salesman just instantly cemented his status. But that fame, that very fame, made him a massive target right before the storm hit.
And the story of how Salesman was created is, it's legendary in theater circles.
Yeah.
Partly because of how fast it happened.
Right. He built that small studio on his farm in Roxbury, Connecticut.
And in that studio, he wrote Act One in less than a single day. Just a phenomenal burst of creative energy.
Yeah.
The rest of the play. He finished it in just 6 weeks.
Incredible. It premiered on Broadway February 10th, 1949, and his director was his close friend at the time, Elia Kazan.
And the reception was just unprecedented. It was a huge commercial success. It was critically acclaimed, and it was historically significant. We need to underline this. Death of a Salesman was the first play ever to win all 3 major awards.
The Pulitzer Prize for Drama, the Tony for Best Author, and the New York Drama Circle Critics Award.
All 3. It ran for 742 performances. It established him instantly as the defining American playwright of his generation.
But we can't just talk about it in terms of awards. We have to dig into why it was such a cultural earthquake.
Exactly. It introduced a new kind of tragedy, a domestic middle-class tragedy. It wasn't about kings or gods or great generals. It was about Willy Loman.
Just a salesman.
A man who believed absolutely in the promise of success through, charm and personality, but who fundamentally failed to be a good husband, a good father, or a success in this new, ruthless corporate America.
And that critique of consumerism is so key. The play just ripped the cover off the dark side of that post-war economic boom. Willie is a victim of a system that promises everything, but delivers nothing for the ordinary guy.
He measures his worth in sales figures and material goods, not in character. And when his sales stop, Willie's entire identity just collapses.
The structure of the play was also just revolutionary. Miller used these expressionistic elements. The walls become transparent. Characters move fluidly between past memories and present reality.
Yeah, he was reflecting Willie's fragmented, tortured mind. It made the audience complicit in his inner chaos. It blurred the line between what was real and what was the dream. It was a formal breakthrough that perfectly matched the thematic critique.
And there's this wonderful little footnote from this period, the connection to Eugene O'Neill, who was the previous titan of American tragedy.
Right. The sources confirm O'Neill sent a congratulatory telegram after the success of All My Sons, and Miller, in turn, invited O'Neill to the opening of Death of a Salesman.
But O'Neill had to decline. He apologized because his Parkinson's disease was so debilitating it made travel impossible.
But the exchange itself is just such a profound moment. It's like one great American dramatist, the voice of the 20s and 30s, recognizing and passing the torch to the new voice of the 40s and beyond.
So Miller had reached the absolute pinnacle. But that pinnacle, as we're about to see, was standing on very, very shaky ground.
So he's at the absolute peak of his success with Salesman, and that fame, as you said, puts him on a direct collision course with the political reality of the 1950s.
Which brings us to the most defining moral conflict of his life. And it all started with the complete breakdown of his friendship with Elia Kazan, the man who directed his greatest success.
The rupture happened in 1952. The political pressure was just at a fever pitch. Kazan, who had once been a member of the Communist Party himself and was now one of Hollywood's most successful directors,
He had a lot to lose.
a tremendous amount to lose. He appeared before the House Un-American Activities Committee, HUAC, and to save his own career, to protect his ability to keep working, He named names.
He identified 8 members of the group theater as former Communist Party members or fellow travelers.
For Miller, this was just a massive betrayal, both publicly and personally. The group theater was this highly influential, left-leaning ensemble. It had fostered so much groundbreaking American drama. To him, Kazan's decision was just a moral capitulation. It was driven by ambition and fear, and it was a betrayal of everything they had shared in their youth.
And Miller's response was immediate and fiercely artistic.
That's the perfect way to put it. He didn't just write an angry essay. He traveled to Salem, Massachusetts to research the 1692 witch trials. He sensed this profound historical parallel.
And the result was the Crucible, which came out in 1953. It wasn't subtle.
Not at all. It was an explicit, thinly veiled allegory. It likened the HUAC hearings, the mass hysteria, the coerced confessions, the ruining of reputations based on nothing but accusations, directly to the Salem witch hunt.
What's important to remember, though, is that the Crucible was only considered somewhat successful when it first came out on Broadway.
Right. It didn't have the immediate commercial triumph of Salesman, but its enduring relevance, its timeless warning against political persecution and mass hysteria, that's what's made it Miller's most frequently produced work around the world.
But the artistic feud with Kazan, it didn't stop there.
No, Kazan tried to justify his testimony through his 1954 film On the Waterfront.
Right, where the hero, Terry Malloy, testifies against union corruption. Kazan was implicitly arguing that his own actions before HUAC were heroic, that they were necessary steps to clean up a corrupt system.
And Miller retaliated with equal fervor. His 1955 play, A View from the Bridge, is the artistic counterpunch. The play is about Eddie Carbone, a longshoreman who outs his co-workers to immigration authorities.
But he does it out of professional and sexual jealousy. He's disguising this destructive private obsession, his desire for his niece, with a public justification.
It was a clear message from Miller that Kazan's heroic testimony was, in his view, motivated by profound self-interest and moral corruption.
And there's that fantastic anecdote that just captures the personal venom between them.
Oh, it's brutal.
When Miller sent Kazan a copy of the script, Kazan apparently joked about directing the film version. And Miller's reply was, "I only sent you the script to let you know what I think of stool pigeons."
Oof. That just shows you the depth of the fracture. And it shows how Miller used his art as both a moral shield and an offensive weapon.
So after that, the political storm came directly from Miller himself. HUAC took an interest in him not long after the Crucible opened.
They probably recognized the power of the allegory. They denied him a passport in 1954, which prevented him from attending the London opening of his own play.
And then, in 1956, when he applied for a routine passport renewal, HUAC used that application as the pretext to subpoena him.
And this happened just as his life was exploding into tabloid fodder because of his relationship with Marilyn Monroe. The timing is crucial.
The public scrutiny was just immense, and Monroe, remarkably, she accompanied him to the hearing. She risked her own massive career right at the height of the blacklist. Her loyalty was just absolute.
The sources confirm she wrote in her personal notes that she was so concerned about protecting Arthur. He's the only person that I trust as much as myself. I mean, that is an extraordinary show of solidarity from the biggest star in the world.
So Miller's testimony, it was a careful calculation. He detailed his own political activities. He admitted that his cooperation with Communist Front organizations had been a mistake. He was emphasizing his patriotism, saying a communist takeover would be a disaster and a calamity.
He was trying to cooperate while still holding on to his integrity.
But the critical moment came down to the names.
Always the names. Before the hearing, Miller had gotten a promise from the chairman, Francis E. Walter, that he would only be asked about his own activities, not anyone else's. But the chairman broke that promise right there in the hearing room. He demanded the names of friends and colleagues.
And Miller famously refused. He just said simply, "I could not use the name of another person and bring trouble on him."
He was making a moral choice over a professional one. It was a decision that mirrored the ultimate stand of his own character, John Proctor, in The Crucible.
And that refusal in the short term cost him dearly.
Hugely. In May 1957, he was found guilty of contempt of Congress. He was sentenced to a fine, a prison sentence, he was blacklisted from Hollywood, and he couldn't get a U.S. passport. The blacklist basically choked off his career. Studios were terrified of employing him. He was in exile in his own country.
But it's important for you listening to understand the legal complexity. His conviction was ultimately overturned.
Right, in August 1958. The appeals court ruled that because the chairman had promised him he wouldn't have to name names, he had been misled. Therefore, the subpoena itself was invalid. It was a massive victory for conscience and legal fairness.
And that experience, being persecuted even for a short time, seems to have permanently focused his attention on social injustice long after the HUAC threat was gone.
Decades later, in the late 1970s, Miller became really active in the Barbara Gibbons murder case in Connecticut. He was specifically supporting the defense of her son, Peter Riley.
Riley had been convicted based on what many believed was a coerced confession.
And Miller saw Riley as being similarly railroaded by the state police and the attorney general. He connected his own personal battle for conscience with the fight for this kid he thought was innocent. He used his fame to bring media attention to Riley's case, which eventually helped lead to his exoneration.
That connection just reveals that Miller's HUAC experience wasn't just some political battle. It became a foundational part of his moral voice. It defined not just his art, but his later activism for anyone he saw as being wrongly accused by the state.
That theme, the heroic individual standing against a powerful, corrupt authority, it just runs like a thread through his entire life.
So if the 1950s were defined by political conflict, they were equally, if not more so, defined by personal drama. And that was primarily thanks to his second marriage.
Right. Miller had married his first wife, Mary Slattery, back in 1940. They had 2 children, Jane and Robert, before they divorced in 1956. But the transition to his second marriage was anything but quiet.
In June 1956, he marries the film star Marilyn Monroe. They had met back in 1951, and she was just such a stark contrast to his intellectual East Coast life. Monroe was just turning 30, and she was profoundly disillusioned with the superficiality of Hollywood.
She desperately wanted stability. She told Miller, "I hate Hollywood. I want to live quietly in the country and just be there when you need me. I can't fight for myself anymore." She was really seeking this intellectual and familial grounding that she thought Miller represented.
And she showed that profound loyalty we talked about, showing up at the HUAC hearing. She also made this huge personal commitment. She converted to Judaism.
Yeah, she did that to express her loyalty and get close to both Miller and his parents. This wasn't a minor thing. That conversion led to Egypt, which was a major foreign market for films, banning all of her movies. Her commitment to him was costly, both personally and professionally.
But the marriage was just strained from the beginning by the intensity of fame, by Monroe's own deeply rooted psychological instability, and her increasing dependence on drugs.
And the beginning of the end really came during the filming of the Misfits in 1961, which is so ironic because Miller wrote it specifically for her. It co-starred Clark Gable.
The filming was an absolute nightmare. Miller later called it one of the lowest points of his life. The set was just chaotic because of Monroe's reliance on prescription drugs, pills to sleep, other drugs to wake up. It led to chronic delays. She struggled to remember lines.
There are these specific anecdotes in the sources that just highlight Miller's total loss of control. The director, John Huston, watching this all unfold, recalled confronting Miller. He said that allowing her to take the drugs was criminal, only to realize that Monroe wasn't listening to Miller at all.
That's heartbreaking. Huston observed that Miller had no say over her actions. It suggests that the playwright who could control these complex moral narratives on a stage was completely powerless in his own domestic drama.
They divorced in January 1961, right before the Misfits premiered, and then, tragically, Monroe died just 19 months later from a likely drug overdose. It was just a profound, short, and incredibly destructive chapter in his life that left these deep scars.
Miller moved on pretty quickly. He married an Austrian photographer, Inge Morath, in February of 1962.
And Morath had, ironically, worked as a photographer documenting the production of the Misfits. So there was this strange link back to all that trauma. They had 2 children together, Rebecca Miller, who became a director, and their son, Daniel.
And this is where we get to the deep family complexity, the really profound private contradiction in Miller's life.
Yeah, this is tough. Their son, Daniel, was born with Down syndrome in November 1966. And the source material is very clear and very stark on what happened next.
Against his wife's wishes, Miller had Daniel institutionalized immediately, first in New York City and then at the Southbury Training School in Connecticut.
And the level of abandonment is just shocking, especially when you contrast it with his public moralizing. Miller never once visited Daniel at the school. He rarely spoke of him. He essentially erased him from his life for decades.
But his wife, Inge Morath, she continued to visit Daniel frequently. She maintained that relationship.
And this decision, it just stands in such severe contrast to the man who publicly fought for Peter Riley, who refused to name names to Congress, who built an entire career on the themes of accountability and moral failure.
When he was asked about his son later in life, he offered this just heartbreaking assessment. He said, Daniel knows I'm a person and he knows my name, but he doesn't understand what it means to be a son.
It's just devastating.
What's fascinating, though, and it provides a little bit of late life light, is the role his son-in-law played.
The actor Daniel Day-Lewis.
Right, who married Rebecca Miller. He frequently visited Daniel at the institution and eventually persuaded Miller to meet with his son after decades of avoidance. It was this external moral intervention that forced Miller to finally confront this intensely guarded private failing.
And the ultimate sign of recognition came after Miller died in 2005. Despite all those decades of emotional distance, Daniel was named as an heir in his will, along with his 3 other children.
So that contradiction, the fierce public moralist versus the intensely guarded private abandonment, it's arguably the single most important key to understanding Miller's legacy.
You have to believe he wrote tragedies about moral failure, precisely because he understood that struggle so acutely, both in society and ultimately in himself.
And just to wrap up his romantic life, which never ceased to be dramatic. After Inge Morath died in 2002, an 89-year-old Miller announced in 2004 that he was in love and planned to marry Agnes Barley.
A 34-year-old minimalist painter.
Right, who he'd been living with since 2002 at his farm. He was determined to live life fully and dramatically right up to the very end, planning to marry an artist 55 years his junior.
So we saw how Miller's personal life directly fueled his great works of the 50s, and that trend continued right into the 1960s, where he tried to process the intense trauma of the Monroe marriage directly through his art.
Which resulted in After the Fall in 1964. It was deeply personal, written not long after the divorce and Monroe's death. And in a major risk, both professionally and personally, it saw Miller reunite with Elia Kazan, who directed the play.
Which is a sign that their professional feud, at least, had thawed a little bit after more than a decade.
But the play generated this tremendous publicity and, frankly, public outrage because of the character Maggie, who was so clearly based on Marilyn Monroe. It was a thinly veiled, intimate look at their destructive relationship.
And it was critically savage in some circles. Robert Brustein, a really influential critic, called it a 3.5-hour breach of taste, a confessional autobiography of embarrassing explicitness.
Brustein even labeled it a shameless piece of tabloid gossip, so it definitely did not get the acclaim of his earlier works.
It seems like when Miller's art got too autobiographical, the public and the critics sort of recoiled.
Yeah, it seems they preferred his moral critique to be delivered through the filter of a Willy Loman or a John Proctor, rather than through his own messy personal life. But despite that uproar, Miller quickly found major success again with The Price in 1968. It was this penetrating family drama about 2 estranged brothers confronting their past and their father's belongings. It was considered his most successful play since Salesman.
So his commercial and critical appeal, once it was filtered through a slightly less personal lens, was far from over.
And beyond the stage, the latter half of his career was really defined by international activism. It emphasized that public moral conscience we keep coming back to. He served as the first American president of PN International from 1965 to 1969.
And PE International, for those listening, is the worldwide association of writers dedicated to promoting freedom of expression and literary rights, especially for writers who are imprisoned or persecuted by authoritarian regimes.
And Miller took this role very seriously. His activism was so effective and so critical of Soviet policies that in 1969, his works were officially banned in the Soviet Union after he campaigned for dissident writers.
Being banned was basically a badge of honor for him. It signified the power of his voice.
And the global reach of his greatest work was really cemented in the 1980s. In 1983, Miller traveled to China to produce and direct Death of a Salesman at the prestigious People's Art Theater in Beijing.
Which was this fascinating cultural experiment, right? Could this deeply American tragedy about consumerism and failure, could it translate into a communist country that was just emerging from Maoism?
And it was a huge success. Miller documented the whole experience in a 1984 book, Salesman in Beijing. He detailed the challenges and triumphs of teaching the play's universal themes to a non-Western audience.
And that same year, the television film adaptation of Salesman, starring Dustin Hoffman as Willy Loman, was broadcast on CBS and got an enormous audience, 25 million viewers.
Yeah.
It just proved the play's enduring mass appeal decades after its premiere.
We mentioned earlier how protective Miller was of his private life, especially about Monroe, but that changed late in his career, maybe as a way to control the historical narrative.
Right. His 1987 autobiography, Time Bends, A Life, broke years of public silence. He finally wrote extensively and in great detail about his experiences with Marilyn Monroe.
And he kept writing new plays into the 90s, tackling corporate corruption in The Ride Down Mount Morgan, social conflict in Broken Glass. In 1996, he spent most of the year working on the screenplay for the film adaptation of The Crucible.
Which notably starred his son-in-law, Daniel Day-Lewis. That's such a poignant link, isn't it, between his greatest political work and the family member who helped engineer that late-life reconciliation with his son, Daniel.
In his final decade, the accolades just piled up, affirming his status as this literary giant. He got the National Medal of Arts in '93, the Dorothy and Lillian Gish Prize in '99, the National Book Foundation's Medal in 2001.
The Prince of Asturias Award in 2002, and the Jerusalem Prize in 2003. His global importance as a moral and artistic voice was just undeniable.
But his public commentary, it stayed provocative. It sometimes drew really strong criticism. In 2001, he delivered the prestigious Jefferson Lecture, which is the U.S. government's highest honor for achievement in the humanities. It was titled On Politics and the Art of Acting.
And in that lecture, he analyzed major political events, including the fiercely contested 2000 U.S. election and political figures like FDR, JFK, Reagan, and Clinton. He argued that their success was tied to their ability to perform or act in a political drama.
He suggested politics was becoming indistinguishable from performance art.
And this analysis drew a lot of fire from conservative critics. They called it a disgrace, arguing Miller was straying outside his expertise, that he wasn't a legitimate scholar of politics. It's clear that even late in life, he was still challenging established powers and drawing controversy.
His final play, Finishing the Picture, opened in 2004, and it was reportedly based on his experience during the chaotic filming of The Misfits.
And then Arthur Miller died on the evening of February 10, 2005. He was 89. He died from bladder cancer and heart failure at his home in Roxbury.
And in this stunning piece of synchronicity, that date was the 56th anniversary of Death of a Salesman's Broadway debut.
Incredible.
Yeah.
Broadway theaters darkened their lights in a massive show of respect. And per his express wish, the Arthur Miller Theater at the University of Michigan is still the only theater in the world that bears his name.
So we've covered the collapse of the American dream in 1929, the political courage of 1956, the personal chaos of the early 60s. What does this deep dive ultimately mean for Miller's legacy?
Well, the synthesis of his life, which we can now see in his archives and public battles, it just reinforces his role as this complex and, often contradictory moralist.
And we know more now than ever before.
Exactly. Biographies based on papers Miller made available before he died confirm that his concern for justice was deeper and broader than just the Cold War. The sources reveal these unpublished works where Miller bitterly attacked the injustices of American racism long before it was taken up by the Civil Rights Movement.
Which confirms this lifelong concern for the deep systemic failures in American society. And yet his literary reputation wasn't without fierce, even caustic, criticism in his later years, especially when he weighed in on contemporary politics.
You see that caustic criticism from figures like Christopher Hitchens, who just attacked Miller for comparing the investigation into Monica Lewinsky to the Salem witch hunt. Hitchens scathingly disputed that parallel, calling it a gross inflation of minor offenses to the level of, execution.
And Hitchens also bitterly noted in his memoir that Miller, despite his prominence as a left-wing intellectual and an advocate for persecuted writers, had failed to publicly support the author Salman Rushdie during the Iranian fatwa over the satanic verses.
Which is a critical point. Miller was clearly capable of immense public bravery, but he sometimes chose silence when other opportunities for moral intervention came up, which led to these charges of moral selectivity.
So what about his legacy for future scholars? What's left behind?
What's left is truly astounding.
Yeah.
The Harry Ransom Humanities Research Center at the University of Texas at Austin holds the extensive Arthur Miller archives. Miller had originally donated early manuscripts back in the 60s, including the original handwritten notebooks and early drafts for Salesman, The Crucible, and All My Sons.
But in 2018, the center acquired the rest of it. Over 200 boxes of materials that fully opened in 2019.
This massive collection lets future generations study his entire creative process. You can literally track the evolution of his ideas from the first little scratches in a notebook to the final drafts. It ensures that the moral and structural machinery of his work stays transparent for study.
And beyond the archives, his family established the Arthur Miller Foundation to honor his legacy by promoting theater arts education in New York City public schools. It's a fitting, practical legacy for a man who believed so deeply in the power of the stage to illuminate truth.
So when we look back across the entire arc of his life, Miller's greatest works, from Willy Loman's Self-Deception to John Proctor's Ultimate Stand, they all revolve around these themes of guilt, memory, responsibility, and the failure of the heroic individual under pressure.
And we've documented that he demonstrated this immense moral courage in his public life by refusing to name names before HUAC, a political act that risked his freedom and his career.
But we have to place that public courage directly alongside his intensely private decision to institutionalize his son Daniel, born with Down syndrome, and to essentially erase him from his family life for decades.
It presents this profound and, frankly, disturbing contrast in personal ethics. He was the man who would sacrifice everything for the principle of non-betrayal in Washington.
But who betrayed his own child in Connecticut.
So as you move forward from this and maybe you go back and revisit these classic plays, what stands out to you? Did his unparalleled ability to craft such compelling, raw, and often tortured moral dilemmas on stage, did it stem directly from his own struggle to reconcile his public bravery? The man who would stand up to the state with those intensely guarded and complex private failings? The man who could not face his own son?
That's the final thought he leaves us with. The distance, or maybe the lack of distance, between the moralist on the public stage and the man behind the curtain.